Hello, my name is Laura Maria Caldarone, host and producer of The Long Haul, its online series on long COVID. With us, we have from Research Aid Networks, my co-host, Dr. Jeremy Rossman, a virologist of the University of Kent. Hi, Jeremy.
Hello, nice to see you today.
Nice to see you too. In the last episode of The Long Haul, Jeremy and we did a special Q&A episode on long COVID, where we talked about the basics of long COVID, such as what is long COVID, what's the probability of getting long COVID, and so on. And also, what do the vaccines and the variants of concern, such as Delta, mean for long COVID? Today, in this episode, we will go through some of the misinformation that we see too often on social media, from falsehoods on COVID that have been with us since the very beginning of the pandemic, to things regarding long COVID, vaccines, tests, masks, etc. Misinformation is nothing new. It has always been bad. But in this pandemic, misinformation causes pain, mental, physical, emotional pain. It causes long COVID and death. Before we start, if you or your loved one has long COVID, please keep in mind that some of the following statements may be difficult to hear, but they are going around social media, and it is important to discuss why they're not true. So Jeremy, let's get to it and start debunking some misinformation.
Sounds good.
So we start with COVID. The first one is, COVID doesn't affect the young and healthy, shield the old and the vulnerable, and end the lockdown.
Right. I mean, this is something that we hear a lot, and it's a really important statement to really talk about, because this is being used as an argument saying that we don't need to take all these precautions because, now that we've shielded the elderly and the high-risk population, there's not really much of a risk for the rest of the population. So why should we take all these measures? Why should we have lockdowns? Why should we have mask mandates and things like that? But the reality is, unfortunately, it's a little bit different. Yes, we have known from early on in the pandemic that people over the age of 65 and those with certain high-risk comorbidities are at greater risk of very severe COVID infection, hospitalization, and fatalities. And this is why the vaccine campaigns in many countries were geared towards vaccinating those people first. And so as we've gotten more and more of that high-risk group vaccinated, we've seen fatalities start to go down. We've seen hospitalizations go down. And that's great news. But in fact, COVID can cause very severe disease in any age group. I mean, we see children with MIS-C and very severe disease that have to be hospitalized. We see healthy young adults with no pre-existing conditions get hospitalized and die of COVID. It doesn't happen in very large numbers, but it does happen. But I think one of the most important parts of this, misinformation is that this specifically focuses on severe hospitalizations and fatalities of COVID. But that's only a very limited view of the disease that COVID causes. And that's because it's not accounting for long COVID. And, if you start to look at the incidence of long COVID, well, that is about 14% of anybody of any age that gets COVID disease can have symptoms that last 12 weeks or longer. So this is a very serious illness that can affect anybody. And that is even present in children. Children, if they get infected with COVID, children between the ages of 2 and 11 even have a 7.4% chance of having symptoms that last 12 weeks or longer. So this is not a mild disease. And this is not something that only affects the elderly or only affects those with high-risk conditions. This can affect anybody, and this is a severe disease, which is why it's so important that we take the actions that we do.
Exactly. And also, I'm going to add to this that we all know and or love someone that is elderly or vulnerable. So fine, don't think about yourself because you're young and healthy, let's say. But what about a parent, a grandparent, or someone that is immunocompromised?
Exactly.
The next one we have is just a little side note. It's the second year of the pandemic, right? It's summer here in Europe and in the States. So a lot has been going on everywhere in the world. And some countries have done better than others. One country that has done well is Australia. Yes, now it's having some problems, but in general, Australia has been doing quite well. This specific tweet is talks about Australia. So it shows that misinformation is everywhere. So here's the tweet. Rest in peace, Australia. 0.15% IFR, just like the flu. Vaccines make the virus mutate and more dangerous, using the PCR test for cases that cannot detect COVID from influenza or other coronaviruses. 98.85% survival rate, ruining people's lives. Now sending them in the army. Shame on you, Aussies. So this one has a lot in it, but let's
Yeah, I'm okay. I'm slightly confused here, but let me try and sort of piece out a couple sort of important things in this tweet and a couple important things to address. First of all, the IFR, this is the sort of infection fatality rate. This is basically, that calculation of saying, what's the percentage chance of if somebody gets infected with COVID-19 that they're going to die. And, the rate is quite low in COVID-19. They're saying, 0.15%, depending on the country and the circumstances, it could be that, it could be, 0.5%, but it's typically seen as being less than 1% of people that are infected with COVID die. And, on one hand, that sounds like that's great news because that's a fairly low percentage. But when we are talking about millions and millions of cases of COVID worldwide, that is a lot of people that have died from COVID. So even small percentages make for a completely unacceptable risk and an unacceptable level. So that's one aspect. But the second aspect is this comparison with flu and saying that, yeah, COVID is no worse than flu. We live with flu every year, so why do we need to do anything different with COVID? And first of all, well, I don't know where they say they got that calculation of saying that that's the same as flu, because it's absolutely not. So our last pandemic was actually a flu pandemic. This was 2009, this was the swine flu pandemic, and the infection fatality rate of that pandemic was far lower. So in fact, this is actually a much larger infection fatality rate that we see with COVID than we do normally with flu. But again, as I mentioned with the last misinformation, this is so focused on that fatality rate, which is really important. But it completely neglects the illness and the disability that's caused by COVID. And, as I mentioned before in the last misinformation, that, having about a 14% chance of having symptoms that last for at least, if not longer than 12 weeks, this is not comparable to the flu. And this is a completely unacceptable risk. This is not a risk that I would be willing to take. Now, I have really no idea what's being talked to about the army or the PCR. There's a lot of sort of additional components in this that I just find slightly confusing. But it's also an important part about sort of misinformation tweets versus actual informational tweets is that, if you package a lot of different things together and sort of buzzwords that people are concerned about, then it sort of draws this attention and sort of makes this huge catastrophe. Whereas if it's sort of genuine, dissemination of information, it tends to be about, okay, well, here's the data that we have on the infection fatality rate, or here's the data that we have on this. When you sort of group all those things together, it gets very confusing and very alarming, but that's also a sign that it's probably not genuine information.
Yeah. And I mean, like you said, this specific tweet is packed with a lot of misinformation. And some of it is misinformation that we have seen for a long time. Like this one of the PCR test. How many times have we seen or heard that the PCR test does not work because negative results are said to be positive, or that they cannot detect COVID from influenza, like this tweet says?
Yeah, so I mean, we'll just sort of touch on that one too, briefly. Is that there's something being said of that they can't detect flu from influenza, so can't detect COVID from influenza. Well, and that's absolutely not true. PCR is specific; it detects one or the other. It's just that certain assays were designed specifically to look for both. Because in the winter, well, you get flu going around, you get COVID going around, and we've seen that people that get infected with both flu and COVID can have very severe disease. So it's a real risk that we need to be looking for. But the assay that's itself always is either, detecting flu or detecting COVID. It's not that it can't distinguish between the two. It's just that we have some assays that look for both, but that's intentional. It's not a mistake on the assay. But the other point that you mentioned that I think is important is that, testing is not perfect. It's not 100%. And, if you think about it, well, okay, so you might be at a very early stage of infection. You get tested, the test doesn't detect anything, but the next day, the viruses continue to replicate, you've gotten a little bit sicker, and now the PCR test might work. So it's not a matter of saying, the tests work or the tests don't work. It's a matter of how they're being used, when they're being used, that really affects the results. So we need both, testing, but we also need that really good strategy of how we're using the tests. And it's important to distinguish how the tests are being used versus what the tests actually do. Because in fact, the tests are really good at saying, right now, do you have, COVID that we can detect that poses a risk for transmission? They're very good at that.
Yeah, whenever I hear people or even like family members or friends that are a bit unsure and they're like, but how is it that this testing or so on, sometimes it looks like it doesn't work, or indeed what you're saying, that one day it says negative and 2 days later it says positive. So what's wrong with this, right? And I've had that in my family. And I say, well, you have to remember, you are testing at a certain point in time. So it's a snapshot of what's going through your body. So if your body hasn't met COVID yet, or isn't, connecting with it yet, then it's going to say negative. But in a little bit later, it's going to be, hey, there's something weird in my body. Here it is.
Exactly. It's all a dynamic process. And so you can't just take one test and assume that, you're good for a long period of time. And that's why often, testing, before like a long flight, or testing, upon say entry to a country, is an imperfect measure. It's a good step. It helps. But, the test the following day might end up being positive just because of where the person is in that process of infection. And so, this is why you need that, you need repeated testing, we need surveillance, we need to be, if somebody has an exposure, you need to be following them over time. There's a lot that we can do. And tests are a really good component of that, but we just need to make sure that we're using them properly.
Exactly. So we took a little bit longer than what we wanted with this one, but it's because it was packed with so much misinformation that, we just do it at once. The next one is more about, as we have seen from the beginning of the pandemic, there has been talk of this whole herd immunity thing through infections and so on. And this tweet is about natural immunity, how it's permanent and natural infection is actually better and safe. So the tweet says, natural infection with COVID is a sure shot way to protect yourself. If you're doubly vaccinated, it will give you this pseudo confidence to roam out and dismiss any symptoms as COVID. While if you're recovered from natural infection in the last 15 months, you are also absolutely safe.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I mean, this is a little bit of a dangerous tweet and some dangerous information here. And it's not factual. I mean, this is part of the whole misinformation tweets, obviously. But basically, what this is looking at is saying, how does the immune response work, and how does immunity work when you get infected with the virus versus how is that working from the vaccine? And you do get immunity from the virus, from a natural infection, and you do get immunity from the vaccine. Now, the issue is that when you get infected with the virus, people get infected at all sorts of different levels. Some people have very severe infections. Some people have very mild infections. Some people have asymptomatic infections. Some people have a lot of virus in their body. Some people have a very little bit in their body. So there's a huge variability there. And one of the problems of that is that when somebody recovers from a natural COVID infection, well, you don't know how immune they are going to be. You don't know how much antibodies they ended up generating, how robust their immune response was, because people have very different infections. So somebody that has a really severe infection might generate a really strong immune response that lasts for many months. And somebody that's asymptomatic might have a fairly mild response that doesn't last very long. And we've seen this, this real disparity, because we've seen that people that have infections were able to be reinfected as short as a month after resolving the first infection. So we know that reinfections can happen, and that can even happen with the same variant. You don't need a new variant for that. So, but then other people have really strong immune response that protect them for months down the line. So just because you had a natural infection doesn't mean that you're fully protected, which is why the recommendation is that even if you've had a natural infection, you still get a booster from the vaccine, because the immunity to the vaccines is a lot more consistent. And especially when you get that booster, because that second dose, sorry, not a booster as we commonly think, but that second dose of the vaccine series, because that second dose boosts your immune system and does so very consistently with a wide range of people. And often that second dose gets you to a higher level of immunity than most people got to from the natural infection. And we actually have that data because we've done those experiments. We've looked at levels of neutralizing antibodies from people with natural infections versus people with 2 doses of the vaccine. So we know what that difference is. And we know that the vaccine immunity lasts. So in fact, I think the information in this tweet, the reality is almost exactly opposite. That, if you have the vaccine, you have a much higher likelihood of being very well protected against COVID than if you have the natural infection. If you have the natural infection, you have a chance of having that really good immunity, but it's not as guaranteed. And so again, this is why we're recommending that, the vaccines are really good. Getting a dose of the vaccine, even if you've had a natural infection, is still really good. And of course, none of this immunity is perfect. There's always that small risk that you can still get infected, which is why precautions are still important on top of the vaccines. But the vaccines are really, really good.
So the next tweet, Jeremy, speaks about something that has been spoken about since last summer, give or take, and in some cases, in some countries, much more than others. For instance, in South America, this is a big one. And it is about Ivermectin. And this is the tweet. This non-pandemic could be over today if the government would have embraced the Ivermectin zinc combination treatment.
Right. So, there's sort of two important points here. The first is that idea that the pandemic could just be over if we did any one thing. And the second point is this, the talk about ivermectin. And, that this is a drug that, if we just used, it would have a huge effect. So, I mean, first of all, when we look at the pandemic overall, there's no miracle cure here. There's no one thing that we can do that's gonna end the pandemic right away. This is a concerted effort that has to happen globally. That is, vaccines, that is masks, that is, good governmental strategies, good public awareness, good effort done globally and internationally. And this is going to take a long time. This is going to be a concerted effort. So there's no miracle cure that's just going to end the pandemic. And anybody that says there's a miracle cure that's going to end the pandemic, even the vaccines are not a miracle cure that's going to end the pandemic. They're a fabulous tool that is making a huge impact, but it's part of a whole strategy. So coming back to the main part of this, which is ivermectin. And this is something that we're hearing a lot about. So ivermectin is a drug that's been used for many years to treat parasitic infections. It's a drug that is really cheap, which is great. It's a drug that has been used for a long time, so we have a lot of data on it. And it's a drug that tends to be quite safe in its use. So this is great because this is sort of what we really want, especially when we think globally. We want a drug that's cheap, that we can get to people, that we know is going to be safe, isn't going to make things worse, that will have a big impact. That would be fabulous. We all really want this. And so there's some data that came out in the literature fairly early on and has been sort of trickling through saying, hey, look, maybe ivermectin has a positive effect, that it might be able to inhibit the virus, that maybe it's actually helping patients. There have been some that have said that maybe actually it's going to prevent infections if people are taking it beforehand, or maybe it's going to stop severe infections or fatalities, or even help with long COVID. So there's been a lot of interest about this. But it's important to sort of take into context how this research is done and how the progress of these studies works, because these are all very small studies. It's just that sort of little bit of initial data that says, hey, this might have a role here. This might have a positive impact. We need to look at this and say whether or not it does actually do that when we start to use it in a lot of people. And so there, actually just yesterday, there was a paper that came out that was a very comprehensive review of all the studies that have been done, that have been published out there, and looked and said, okay, how robust are those studies? How well were they done? How many people were involved? What can we conclude from that? Can we conclude that there is a positive effect of ivermectin or not? And the results of that review said that we can't conclude that ivermectin has a positive benefit on any aspect of COVID, from prevention to mitigation of severe disease to treatment of long COVID. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't potentially a benefit here. What this means is that all of the data that we have right now does not support the idea that there's a positive benefit. So we shouldn't go out and just use it because it doesn't look like there's that evidence that says it works. Now, this is a great case for saying we need those big studies. We need those big studies that test whether or not it actually will have a benefit. And those studies are in progress, but we don't have the data from them yet. Now, I just want to quickly mention sort of two other important points here. One is that, people have talked about, oh, well, there is one study that did a good case control that looked and said, yeah, there was a really strong benefit of ivermectin in the study from Egypt. But unfortunately, that study was actually just recently retracted because the journal discovered there were some issues with the methodology that could not be supported that affected the interpretations of the entire paper. And so because of that, they had to remove that paper because it actually looked like it was a flawed study. And so without that, we don't have that data that says there is a positive benefit. And in reality, this is very similar to what happened months ago with hydroxychloroquine, because very early on, we had those small studies that said, look, maybe there's a positive benefit. Maybe this will inhibit the virus, or maybe this will have a benefit on severe disease. And so people got really excited. People also did some really big studies. Now, the really big studies that looked at a lot of people and did it very rigorously said, in fact, actually, yeah, there's no effect. It doesn't help patients. But that didn't stop people from those early studies going out and using it. And unfortunately, some people used it inappropriately, which is not good. So it's just important that this is very early data, and we need those studies to actually say how it works. And those are ongoing. We're just not there yet. And so this is an ongoing process, but right now the data does not support ivermectin have any positive role. And the last important thing here is that there's that argument that says, well, okay, maybe it's the big drug companies, maybe it's the pharmaceutical industries saying, okay, we want to suppress these studies because we want to market a really expensive drug to make a lot of money instead of having this cheap drug. But I'll use the argument of dexamethasone here, because that is a very cheap drug that we did the studies on. We saw that in certain cases, there's a really positive benefit. And this is now used in a lot of situations around the world. So just because it's cheap, and just because the pharmaceutical industry is a for-profit industry, doesn't mean that something that is really beneficial isn't going to have data that is out there and isn't going to be used if it is in fact beneficial. But we just need to do the data, we need to do the science, and we need to ensure that in fact this does work. And we're not there yet with ivermectin.
And also with what you just said for Ivermectin, yeah, I can't pronounce, is the fact that if you take the example of the pharmaceuticals, yes, they're for profit. And basically what I want to say is, for misinformation, also think that not because one thing is true, then it immediately automatically makes another thing true, or vice versa, right? It can be really beautiful outside, but it can be very cold. So one is good, one is bad.
Exactly. It's really important, because just because it's a for-profit industry doesn't mean that it's this massive conspiracy.
The next one is not exactly a misinformation tweet, but what is said is incorrectly written or said, let's say. And it's regarding healthy lifestyle. We've seen that with vitamin D, so maybe you can mention that, and so on. So the tweet goes, "Let's be a bad host for COVID by doing a healthy lifestyle."
Yeah, this is a very interesting one, and I completely agree with your assessment here that this is not misinformation, but it doesn't give the complete picture, because a healthy lifestyle is really good. Having, proper levels of vitamins, physical fitness, not smoking, all of this, getting enough sleep in the evening, all of this makes a big impact on just in general how healthy your body is, how well your immune system is performing, and your ability to resist infections. But this is sort of a general phenomenon that, being healthy, your body responds a little bit better. But that doesn't mean there's a big difference in saying that, your body's healthy and maybe a little bit more resistant to saying that if you're all you have to do is be healthy or take vitamin D or take some supplements or exercise a lot and you won't get infected. Or if you do get infected, that you won't get severe disease or you won't get long COVID. And unfortunately, that is not true. I've heard so many stories of people that were incredibly fit, that were, very healthy, marathon runners, good levels of vitamins, like very healthy people that got COVID, that had severe disease, that developed long COVID. This happens. We hear this a lot. So it's not enough to protect you from getting infected. It's not enough to protect you from severe infection or from getting long COVID. But it helps. Your body is responding better. The more healthy you are, the better your body's able to respond. But it's not a prevention. It's not enough to say, okay, I don't need to wear a mask, or I don't need to get vaccinated, or if I get infected, I don't have to worry about it because it won't be a problem. And the same thing goes with vitamin D. And I'll just mention that specifically since we hear about that so often, because there's a lot of misinformation going around saying that, all we need to do is take massive doses of vitamin D and we'll be perfectly fine. COVID won't be a risk anymore. And, vitamin D does have a very positive role on the immune system. And if you're deficient in vitamin D, your immune system doesn't respond as well. And so in that case, it's important to make sure that you're not deficient in vitamin D. But even if we weren't in the middle of a pandemic, I would say it's important to make sure you're not deficient in vitamin D. This is an important part of how your body functions. So, but there's a big difference in saying you're deficient in vitamin D from saying that, if you just have this excess dose, it will work as a cure or a prevention. And that, again, we have very good data on. We say that, if you're deficient on vitamin D, that's bad. So make sure that you're not deficient on it. But having a massive excess dose doesn't help. It's not a way to prevent getting COVID. It's not a way to prevent severe infection or to prevent long COVID. Unfortunately, again, it would be great if it was, but unfortunately, it's just not enough. It's a good step to make sure you're healthy, but it's just not enough.